Hello all, my name's Sibley Lovett. I'm a principal in the Education, Employment, and Welfare practice, the Boston Consulting Group. I'm very eager to be with you here today to talk about the small question of how to mobilize the education sector for climate action. So whether that is climate literacy in classrooms to drive behavior change and collective action, or green skills for a just transition from a brown to a green economy, or quality education for all to drive adaptation. We are here to talk about it all, and I'm joined by my three panelists, Max McCabe, the COO at the Education's Outcomes Fund, Suzanne Ehlers, CEO at Malala Fund, and Margot Brown, VP of Environmental Justice and Equity at EDF, to discuss with you today. So, recognizing we have a short 40 minutes here, and we're going to dive straight in, but we welcome questions throughout. You'll see you have some fodder for discussion on your seats in front of you, and we look forward to robust debate. So, with that, Max, when folks think about climate action, oftentimes the education sector is not the sector that comes first to mind. It may be energy for greening the grid, finance for green investing, ESG, CPG even for greening supply chains. What, in your words, is the mobilizing call for why education needs to mobilize for climate action?
Thank you, Sibley, and hi, everyone. So we've got more than 130 countries that have now signed up to reaching net zero by 2050. Now, net zero can be critiqued, but as a kind of a broad point to move towards, we've now got a degree of consensus as this is where we need to be getting. Now, the pathway to get to net zero is broadly halving emissions every decade from 2020 to 2050. The pathway to get to halve emissions by 2030, we have kind of line of sight of how that needs to be achieved. We need kind of a massive shift to renewable energies. We need to implement technological change. That's a kind of flippant shorthand. I sometimes talk about the electric cars and solar roofs. Now, we're miles off track from where we need to be, but ultimately we know the route to get there. But to get to halve emissions from 2030 to 2040, and then to halve again from 2040 to 2050, is going to need real behavioral change by a new generation of committed citizens. It's going to need real systemic changes in the global economy. These massive changes, I would argue, and argue very strongly, will be impossible unless we start leveraging the power of the education system. And the education system in its kind of broadest sense, so both formal and informal, kind of K-12 to corporate professional development, all of these facets of the education system need to be mobilized for climate action. And given the kind of the leaders of tomorrow are in schools today, we need to make this change now. We should have done this sort of 10 years ago, but as the Chinese proverb goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the next best time is today. This is why I think we need to mobilize education for climate action today.
Margot, I see you smiling over there.
Yes.
Would love to hear from you a little bit about what does that look like? What does that look like in classrooms and communities? Climate action, climate literacy certainly has a curricular aspect. Would love to hear from you.
That's an excellent question, Sibley. And I think we all know that knowledge is power. But when knowledge is combined with place-based learning, it's so much more powerful. And I am a firm believer that when you connect place-based learning with knowledge, you get activism. And I'm going to share a quick story with you. 30 years ago, I was a high school student, and I was a member of my environmental club. And to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Earth Day, or 20th anniversary of Earth Day, we were asked to go out and do something in the community. So I put together a really quick, simple flyer that said, here are 10 things that you can do to save the planet. And I distributed them to all of my neighbors in mailboxes. And a couple neighbors were lucky enough to get a lecture from 16-year-old Margot on climate change. And when I take that learning and applied it 20 years later at the Environmental Protection Agency, where I was in charge of outreach and engagement for the Office of Children's Health Protection, what I did in that role was partnered with experts at EPA and national programs like the Boys and Girls Club of America and Scholastic to develop climate curricula. But that climate curricula was based in place-based learning. So what we did is we went well beyond climate literacy. Yes, that curricula did teach kids about climate. But the most important thing that that literature did was it taught kids to connect climate with their community. When you can make something real, all of a sudden it becomes more powerful. And so these students were asked to come up with a simple solution around climate change in their own community. And the benefits were incredible. We reached probably more than 100,000 children. So think about that, it's 100,000 small actions that were taken in communities by school-age children. And these kids learned about climate change. They also had to articulate what the problem was that they were trying to solve. And third, and most importantly, we were able to activate them. And that activism is so incredibly powerful and needed to get us to net zero.
So it sounds like you're saying it's not just a didactic experience, it's also the experiential learning, sort of the climate action projects that are mobilizing students in schools today. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it is so important for them to see the connection. Because if you don't see that connection, how are you ever going to drive to a solution? And also, for them to understand that they're part of the solution. You know, climate is so overwhelming, like, where do I begin, where do I start? You start at home, you start in your neighborhood.
It's an interesting thought experiment. We think of sort of Italy, New Zealand, Mexico doing these top-down, climate literacy must be in curricula for our school-age children. There maybe is a sort of twist on that of it also needs to be empowerment and activism enabling, it sounds like we're saying as well.
Absolutely. It cannot just be, you know, as you said, didactic learning. That experiential piece is so incredibly important if you want a citizenry to act, you know, now.
I love this idea of the citizenry acting now. I'm wondering if we take that into some of the green skills aspects. So we think not just about educating our primary and secondary school students, but people in the workforce today. Max, wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about green skills. What does that look like? Is it both sort of a technical, a transformative? Like, how do we scope the idea of green skills, and what does that mean for education and climate action?
Yeah. I want to just quickly come back on Margot's point, because I think it's this whole empowerment piece and building student agency through climate education, I think is so important. And there's more research that's needed for this whole field, but there is some kind of nascent research demonstrating the power that once children and young people are empowered around the climate, the kind of effect that they can then have on their broader communities and on their family members, have this kind of whole ripple effect where you can actually have such greater change through that sort of empowering education. But on the sort of just transition, for me, I think there's a few levels here. The first of which is this tackling the green skills gap that exists today. To
be provocative, what does that mean, Max?
Well, so in the UK, for example, there was a government policy about trying to improve the energy systems in people's homes, like move away from gas boilers to a greater number of ground source heat pumps. But when the policy was announced, there was only 700 engineers in the whole country who could fit ground source heat pumps. Now, if you wanted a gas boiler, there's 100,000 engineers you could go to. So as a result of that green skills shortage, the policy ultimately failed. It had nowhere near the impact that it should have had. So this is happening in geographies around the world where you just have a skills shortage of those skills that are needed in order to deliver green policies. But more broadly, I think as we recognize we're going to have to shift global economies away from high emitting industries, there are going to be job losses. There are going to be sectors of the economy that need to decline, and that can either lead to job losses or you have to retrain people to move them into alternative forms of employment. And this is where education, I feel, has to play an absolutely pivotal role in the just transition to ensure that as economies shift and sectors decline and grow, ultimately the losers can't be working people. If ultimately green policies lead to people getting poorer, people losing their jobs, then they're going to lose support. And I think the Gilets jaunes protests in France, when you had sort of taxes levied on fuel duties, are a prime example of this. A policy that made people feel poorer as a result of trying to support the environment led to mass protests and ultimately the policy being reversed.
Sounds like you're almost saying there's like a political argument for green skilling. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thoughts from others on the topic of green skills before we shift forward? I'm seeing some smiles over there.
Well, I think it's absolutely true. You have to do this. I mean, we're at a nexus where that if we don't take this seriously and do it now, you know, our entire future is at stake. And so we have to prepare students today for the jobs of tomorrow.
It's interesting on this aspect of sort of the jobs for tomorrow. So I work for a consulting firm. We work with many, many, many different types of clients. And of course, you know, energy, we have folks that are square in the center of this, but it sounds like we're saying even if you're a policymaker, right, if you are an urban planner, you're going to have similar transitions that you need to be able to enable and make trade-offs around, and in a way that is, Max, as you're saying, not going to have a negative impact on communities that are already being impacted.
I guess, Sibley, what I would add to that, and this is, of course, from the Malala Fund perspective, which works globally to bring the 130 million girls around the world who are out of school into school, is to say that to not forget that there's always a gendered element to this. And let's be sure that when we're talking about either the provision of climate change education, we're thinking about the development of new curricular approaches, we're thinking about the just transition, that we're always making sure that we're thinking about boys and girls in sort of equal access, and that we're really trying to get at some of the systemic barriers that prevent girls and young women from getting involved in some of these exciting STEAM and otherwise fields. Just that would be the Malala Fund intervention on that skilled piece.
Sounds like there's almost the not idyllic vision, but this could potentially be an opportunity to remake the composition of the workforce in a more equitable way, in some way. Would that be too far of a limb to go out on, Suzanne?
Not from my perspective, no. I mean, I guess what I would say to that, so first of all, this is my first time at this conference, and maybe the first time that Malala Fund has had a presence here. So how exciting it is to be a part of conversations that are both domestic and global in nature, and how we're bringing our experience in, you know, sort of breaking down the barriers that prevent girls from going to school all over the world, and the way that those play out and manifest really in kind of all geographies in sort of big and small ways. So yes, I do think that we see this as an opportunity to sort of redevelop and reinvent, even reimagine the workforce for the future. What I would say when someone comes to me and says, well, Malala Fund's about girls' education, why on earth are you working about climate change? The biggest point of data that I have is that the girls with whom we work said we had to work on climate change. We have a digital online newsletter. The #1 topic that girls pitch is climate change and education. The #1 story we hear in the targeted geographies that we work around the world is that I can't get to school because the floods block my way every day. So just to say that the evidence is there, that girls are thinking about this and wanting to get activated on it, and then don't have sort of like a way to connect those dots and to get more engaged. So absolutely a way of reimagining the workforce of the future.
You mentioned the floods blocking one on one's way to school. Obviously, in the climate action space, we have adaptation, we have mitigation. Would love to hear thoughts on what is the role of education in the adaptation and resilient context. Yeah. I'll throw this out to the group, whoever would like to jump in first.
Who wants to go first? Yeah. Say the question again, sort of in the role of adaptation, or the role of education in
enabling adaptation.
Enabling adaptation. I mean, I guess there's sort of a couple of ways that I would think about it. We have a climate change and sort of girls' education approach that comes across 4 pillars that aren't totally unrelated to the 3 pillars that you will see described in that wonderful paper that's on your chair with the QR code. The first is around access. So a little bit of the story that I just told of, you know, by 2025, I think it is, that we expect almost 13 million girls to literally and physically be unable to access places of educational learning because of climate change impacts. We think of it in terms of skills, so we think of this, you know, sort of skills development, the just transition to the green economy, and then my point earlier, just that has to be gender responsive, and we have to be really mindful and intentional about the sort of the gendered element to that skills building and that workforce development. In terms of education, also instilling values is another angle that we come at. So I know that we sort of think of climate change as sort of a truly global issue, and yet we know that the impacts, and Margot, certainly you care about this deeply, as we all should, disproportionately being felt in the communities that didn't cause the problem in the first place. And so what is the role of education in really building responsible and value-driven global citizens for the future? And then the last pillar of our sort of four-part is activism, which both of my colleagues have already sort of touched on. And so again, climate as a part of education is, for me, a bit of that, the marriage of those four.
Yeah. It makes me think of what Max was saying at the beginning around sort of the decades argument. And even when we think about sort of adaptation and resilience for the future, we don't know exactly what that will look like, right? And if we're going to be prepared to respond, then we have to equip people through a bit of maybe a more flexible enabler in some ways than, building seawalls or what have you, like as important as those are, but can education be sort of a more flexible lever in some ways for some of these priorities?
Well, and climate change is certainly not the only crisis that we face that's forcing us to think differently about the resilience of education systems. So over the last 2 years, Malala Fund has had to pivot completely to respond to the COVID pandemic with even more girls out of school, and many of them with probably very little, if any, chance of returning to school. So I think of COVID, I think of climate. I can't not mention the crisis in Afghanistan, and that tomorrow marks 200 days since girls have attended secondary school. That's a crisis, and again, education systems and sort of resilient, sort of influence and policy-making areas that can help ward off those sorts of crises for what we call a girls' education emergency.
There's an interesting piece here around girls' education certainly being a community sort of empowerment from the bottoms up. How does education play into this question of climate justice writ large? Margot, would love to hear from you a little bit about your work on that front as well.
I'm so glad that you asked me that, because equity is such an integral part of climate education, and it is often left out when we think about climate education. In order for us to solve this climate crisis, it is imperative that we include climate justice and environmental justice at micro and macro levels, because we're not going to do it without this understanding. And education is a really powerful lever to get us there. And, I'm doing that right now in my work at EDF. This whole conference is K to Gray. Well, the grayer crowd at EDF, what I'm doing with them is really beginning to engage in training across the organization. Because in the past at EDF, environmental justice is sort of set out here, where it needs to be integrated into all of the work that we're doing. And we are definitely on that path. Another thing that I'm doing in my role at EDF is really beginning to invest in programs that afford undergraduate and graduate students the opportunity to engage in place-based learning by working for fence line and frontline communities. Let me say that again. It's having students work for fence line and frontline communities. So what does that look like? Well, one of the things that we've done is we've partnered with an organization called the Communities and Colleges Partnership Program. And this is an incredible program where C2P2 provides pro bono technical assistance from colleges to communities that address community-driven needs. Let me say that again. It's free, pro bono technical assistance from colleges to communities that address community-driven needs. And this approach, of course, it has tremendous benefits for the community because the students are able to address the community's needs in a way that is really unique, because these communities are so often undervalued and underheard. And the benefit to the students is incredible, because what we now have is a group of climate and environmental justice leaders who understand the connection between place and environment. They understand the connection between systemic racism and climate outcomes. And those kind of efforts that are provided through that program in partnership with the work that we do at EDF has tremendous potential to really begin to address the climate crisis at a micro level and at a macro level, because it's informing how we do our work at EDF.
Many nods from across the group. It's interesting to think about what is that micro level in different contexts. Suzanne, perhaps could you speak a little bit to how do you see that playing out through some of your female activists who I know are deeply embedded in the climate action movement globally, not just in, for instance, North America, where we happen to be right now, but across other geographies as well? Because I think that sort of micro to macro is very much pertinent across.
Yeah, I mean, I was nodding so much because I've already learned two things from Margot today, and one is to put flyers along the edges of the chairs to sort of pull people in, and the second is this idea that when you make an important point, you say, let me say that again. Like, I just love that, right? Like, let's put an emphasis like on what we're really trying to get across here. So I would say the answer to your question, Sibley, and sort of building off what Margot reminded me of, I mean, I think one thing that we see from the young activists that are in touch with us, and I was remiss in not mentioning this earlier, is they're not asking us to work on climate, carbon tax and sort of sinks. They're asking us to work at the intersection of justice, equity, and climate. They're asking us to interrogate systemic racism. They're asking us to interrogate why their communities are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. Like, they're not taking a scientific and technical approach always, although of course sometimes they are. They're taking an adaptation and resilience and building strength and power approach to climate, which gets back, I think, to your point around place-based learning and just how these girls and young women are responding to sort of what's unfolding in front of them and trying then to pursue an education that's going to bring real relevance and resonance for when they enter the paid workforce.
It's, when you describe it that way, it seems like how can education not be a core part of the solution if we're really, really grounding ourselves in the experience that people are having today and the ability to transform their circumstances. Like, education is our go-to lever for that in so many contexts. You mentioned earlier, Suzanne, Afghanistan, COVID, even within a slightly narrower context, educators have many competing priorities. Mm-hmm. Teacher burnout, student learning loss. Name your litany of challenges, many of which we've heard at other panels today. What is it that is putting this at the top of the list, or that should put this at the top of the list for our educators in the audience? I'm realizing
I'd like to start by saying to any educator in the audience, thank you. I'm a mom of 3 small kids, and I take my hat off to every single educator. Because when the COVID crisis started, I had a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 9-year-old. We're at the tail end of it, and today they are 8, 10, and 11. That's a really long time, especially for my 5-year-old. And the teachers, as we say in the Black church, have done the Lord's work. I mean, these people have truly done the Lord's work over the last 2 years. And so I think before we can even have this conversation around climate, when I was at the EPA, we're trying to push educational materials on teachers, and it's like, they have so many obstacles that they have to address. And so it's so incredibly important that we meet them where they are and understand the burdens that they are dealing with. I mean, they're dealing with suicide, they're dealing with some really tough stuff. And so I can't come and talk to you about the climate crisis unless I'm also talking to you about the needs that you have as a teacher. But, to your question around what motivates me, my answer is really simple. It's Vivian, August, and Eleanor. Those are the names of my 3 children. And every child is what motivates me to get out of bed every morning and do my work. Because we used to always say at the EPA, children represent none of our past, a small portion of our present, but all of our future. And our future depends on our ability to educate them in a way that they are able to become tomorrow's leaders. And it's so important that we do the work of the Malala Fund and educating girls and women. I believe the solutions to our climate crisis reside right now in our children, and it is our job to make sure that they have the environment and the education to solve the crisis that we've created.
Can I pick up that
You may.
beautiful thread that's been left on the stage here? I'll answer your question, Sibley, in a slightly different way, which is like with all these competing concerns, and just to echo Margot's shout out to teachers and educators, 2 children of my own in DC schools, what a journey these last couple of years have been, and how much it has deepened what profound respect I have for people who work in schools at all levels. But I would give you a story of a donor who's recently invested in Malala Fund, came to us with a climate lens. We work on climate, we work on climate justice, we work on resilience and adaptation efforts. We want to interrogate your programs. And interrogate our programs, they did. Looked every which way, the program work that we support, the Girl Fellows that we partner with, the education champion the sort of network that we've built in 8+ countries around the world. And at the end of the day, this donor gave us a 7-figure unrestricted gift because girls' education was enough of an answer to the climate crisis that they didn't even need to restrict the money. So in some ways, the sort of what teachers should be doing is what they're doing, right? Building responsible, responsive, global citizens of tomorrow who can think critically, who can analyze, who can ask good questions, who can show curiosity, who can actually reintroduce civil disagreement in a world that doesn't seem to have it anymore. That's my answer to sort of why we put climate at the top. You actually don't put climate at the top. You put building the citizens of tomorrow at the top and navigating then the very difficult pathway that we've left them as the older generation.
I love that, particularly as a former high school teacher myself. When I think about, my grading, and I was a high school English teacher, so vocab quizzes out the wazoo, right? And thinking about adding one more thing to that, I also look at the data around, teachers want to integrate climate action and climate literacy into their curricula, but how? What's the PD? Where's the off-the-shelf resource that I can leverage? And the thing that I think gives me hope in that are the community resources that I see for teachers. So whether that's as a Teach for America alum, I know there's a climate call that happens on Thursdays once a month to resource share. I think of T4 Education. You see these networks out there, and so I think that also is a compelling near-at-hand solve for teachers who are doing their core work and also want to find a way to integrate this in. Yeah.
If I could just jump in. Yeah, so I think I totally agree with both points from Suzanne and Margot on empowering teachers and not sort of adding to the burden that teachers already dealing with. And again, as a former classroom teacher, I know the idea of there being something else to put on your list is just a terrifying prospect. But then also looking at the children I used to teach and the kind of amount of sort of creativity and ideas and energy. And so much of that we're hearing and seeing from them that wants to be directed towards the climate, to tackling just probably the biggest existential issue of our times. And so thinking about how we can harness that is what gives me a huge amount of energy. And I think it's something that we need to ensure as educators or as those working in this field, that we're really listening to young people and making sure we're elevating their voices and responding to their calls. But this is why I think then needs to go to the policy level and ensure that if this is moving into curriculums and moving into classrooms, that it's done so in a way that is ensuring there's the right professional development. There is the sort of time and space in the curriculum, and it's not another thing on top, but it's something that's given the space that it deserves.
Let's get down to brass tacks for a minute, Max. What does that mean? Does that mean time in the schedule? Does that mean it has to be assessed? Does that mean like it goes across all various curricular subjects? We won't hold you to what you say here, but I'd love your riff on what that means.
I will.
Yeah. On camera, it's going to be here. I think it's a great question, and to be totally honest, I don't have the answer. And I think at the moment there isn't the depth of research and knowledge and understanding about what is the right way to do this. And in terms of a kind of call to action for this crowd and others at this conference is we need to be investing in this research. We need to be doing actually we need to be assessing the curriculum. It needs to be climate action projects. It really needs to be all of the above because the crisis is so great and the time is so short. But then at the same time, we need to be assessing and we need to be understanding which is the most effective route by which we can really deliver change. And then those most effective routes should be scaled and they should be shared across different geographies, across different sectors. So all of the above, but let's assess it, let's understand what's most effective, and then let's scale the things that work best.
I love that. I think you took a slightly different twist on my favorite out, which is test and learn, right? So try things, experiment, know you're not alone, and then share what's working and what's not. Yeah.
I would also say, Sibley, from the community that I was in before global education was women's health globally. And I was on the advocacy side of things, but in the service delivery community, there was a tendency to blame frontline sort of healthcare workers for all that didn't happen in client interactions. So if we weren't really sort of advancing the human rights of women and girls as it related to access to contraception, for example, it was always the fault of those frontline health workers who would then come back and say, but I haven't had training. I haven't had further professional growth and development. I don't know that there's 7 or 8 different kinds of contraceptive methods and I'm only allowed to sort of offer 2 of them because that's what we have. So for me, the lesson there was really just always deepening the investment in the resource that is that frontline human rights defender, which in my previous example was sort of, folks working in health clinics in rural parts of Zimbabwe. And in this example is teachers across the world in classrooms who were looking to deliver 21st century knowledge and curriculum and need the tools and the training and the professional development and, quite frankly, the care and compassion to do their jobs well.
I was just going to say, seems really overly simplistic, but as a researcher, the thing that you got to do is ask people, ask the teachers. I mean, truly, to Max's point around assessment, ask them what they need. It's not, this top-down, we're going to develop this curriculum, or we're going to develop this, and we're going to give it to you and force you to do it. Ask them what they need to be able to deliver climate education. And the other thing you need to do is ask the students, what's the best way to receive that information? And by asking the person who's delivering the information and receiving the information, we're going to get more holistic approaches around how we really begin to do this in a way that is going to resonate with the teachers and with students.
I love that idea of resonating with teachers and with students. It's sort of integral to your context and your environment right there. That's sparked a question for me. Oftentimes, I think when people think of greening the education system, they go operational, right? School buses, food, waste, water. How do we see that fitting in? We haven't touched on that yet. Is that a part of education's responsibility as a sector in driving for climate action? How does it sort of compare size-wise versus some of these other roles that the education sector can play?
I think it absolutely does. I mean, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has tackled this. They have guidelines, unfortunately, that sit on shelves. They do. They're amazing guidelines. I've worked on them. They have guidelines on where and how you should site a school, what you should do if your school is next to a highway. They also have incredible guidelines around creating healthy school environments and talking about low cost, no cost, and more expensive alternatives to address it. But again, it's that layering. So one of the things that we did at EPA is we work with superintendents. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's like, let's work with the superintendents. And when I say superintendent, I mean like the janitors. Let's work with the folks who are cleaning the buildings, and let's talk about green cleaning. And let's approach this from a different way, because I think the thing that we have to remember about this climate crisis is it's all of us in this together. It's not policymakers, it's not businesses, it's everyone. And until we use an all of us approach, it's going to be impossible to solve this crisis. And so I do think everyone and every place throughout the education spectrum has a role to play.
I think, totally agree. I think when you can integrate the sort of change on infrastructure and bring it into the classroom as well, and so it's not just school buses are greening or solar panels going up on the school roof, but actually that is brought into the classroom as well, and so the children understand, or the young people understand what those changes are and the effect it's having on their local community. I think that is, again, how you can have this multiplicative effect of climate policy. And so when people are going home and talking to their families, talking to their communities, I think that's how you can really leverage the power of education beyond the classroom.
This is making me think of this in a couple of different global contexts that I've heard of. I know there's the Green Schools program in India where Max, just as you're saying, they're both researching the impacts of climate on their local community, thinking about how their school's infrastructure can change, and then tracking it. Frankly, the leader of this program who is describing the most compelling thing is watching middle schoolers read out on stage and say, this is what our wastewater was for the past month or so, is really starting to internalize that place-based approach, Margot, that you were speaking about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of schools that are already doing exactly what Max is saying. The challenge is that every school should be doing it. And when you get to the places where Suzanne works, how do you do that when you're overcoming like basic obstacles just to get you to school? And so it's really thinking so holistically about this. And I think that that's where we have to begin and end, is with holistic thinking.
I know we only have a few minutes left here, and so would love to, before we open it up for questions, if we have a moment at the end, ask this group. We have a really wide audience here today. We have funders, we have educators, we've got policymakers, quite a broad swath. What is the the ask for action that we would give our audience members, both present here and remote? I know, a small question on which to end.
I can give a one quick action, which is download that report and read it. And in the back of that report, it gives the different groups kind of what needs to happen in this space. But I really think, for me, there is just a piece around coordinating all the actors that are working in the intersection of education and climate, and ensuring that we are elevating the amazing work that's already happening and investing to innovate and bring new ideas to the table. Because I really don't think we're going to get to net zero or maintain a kind of 1.5 degree pathway unless we're leveraging the power of education.
Want to go next? Yep. I think my first thing is sort of a call to action, just to bring curiosity always. And part of that curiosity for me is about sort of bringing systems thinking and kind of dot connecting to stuff. I mean, I started my career in private philanthropy, doing some of the earliest philanthropic engagement on climate change, went into global women's health, and climate change was there. We were working on the adaptation and resilience side of it. And then I get to Malala Fund, and within 2 weeks of being on the job, girls around the world, they're like clamoring that we work on climate justice. So it's not, the issue's not going away. You're not going to get away from it. So bring curiosity to the equation and figure out from where you sit how you can make the sort of the coalition come together.
So I usually have one call to action anytime I get this question, and the answer is to vote, because public policy is driven by public perception, and it's a cycle and a loop that we get into. And so we have to have leaders who believe in science and believe that climate change is real, because it's going to be really hard for us to get out of this cycle without having those individuals in place who believe climate change is real and it's happening right now. So voting is number one. And the second thing that I encourage everybody to do is to read and to learn about environmental justice and climate justice, because those are two huge components that are missing from education. I don't mean just education of children, I mean from K to Gray, that it's so important that you understand the intersectionality between climate justice and environmental justice when thinking about our climate crisis.
I love that. My last ask for all of you is one that you can immediately execute on, and so I hope you do, which is to have a conversation with somebody about this topic. I cannot tell you the number of people who, when we first started several years ago working at the sort of intersection of education and climate and having conversations around this, said, oh yeah, I studied climate change in class in 8th grade, right? That's the intersection, right? Like that's the role that these two sectors have to play for each other. And so I would encourage you to both interrogate your own thinking, as Margot was saying, but also interrogate others. Have conversations. What does it mean for this to be in terms of coming to life in your own world, whether that's how you vote, how you buy, et cetera. So looking forward to continuing those conversations in about a minute as we wrap here. And with that, we'll open it up for questions from the group. Thank you very much. I saw a hand back there, and then around. Also, we're probably going to wrap before time, but I think we've got about 10 minutes, so we're happy to go into questions sort of off between as well.
Hi, my name is Lil Milagro, and I'm with Mycelium Youth Network, and we prepare young people for climate change. And I'm hoping that you can speak to the role of youth in being able to transform culture long term, so not just as kind of like passive recipients of education, but as people that are actively trying to transform the world. So can you just talk about the role of young people in being able to really transform culture, especially in a place as a change maker?
Are you going to take a few questions, or what's your...
Well, I think we're at time formally. Happy to, if folks have to go, feel free to hop out. But happy to speak to that. And then if we have other questions that have been our 10 minutes, we can keep going. On that front, one of the most compelling things that we've done in our research over the past couple of years is actually start to talk to young people and hear from them what a motivation it is, and then the change agents that Margot was describing. So I think you're spot on in terms of youth activism as a key driver, and again, one that's perfectly synergistic with education writ large.
Yeah.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think it's so important. And I think the one thing that we don't do enough of is listen to our youth. They have incredible solutions and incredible ideas around how to get out of this climate crisis, and it's getting them to act and to truly listen and to empower them in a way that they will become even greater and bigger activists.
With that, I'm getting a hand wave, so I'm going to wrap us formally, but happy to discuss amongst all, and thank you again for coming.